Hello, my name is Lou Marcos, and I'm a professor of English and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University, where I have taught since 1991. I am a huge fan of classical Christian education and have spent the last 20 years speaking for schools and conferences all over the country. I loved it so much, I brought my kids with me, and they loved it so much that my son teaches at a classical Christian school near San Antonio, Texas, and my daughter teaches at a classical charter school near Dallas. So we are a classical family. Why do I love classical Christian education? Why do I think it's the answer to so many of our educational woes in our nation? Well, that's the reason I wrote this book, Passing the Torch, an apology for classical Christian education. The approach I take is, I think, fairly unique and important to understanding the essence and importance and vitality of classical Christian education. I begin with a lengthy introduction about the nature of man, because if you don't know who we are, how can you possibly educate us? We are not the products of socioeconomic forces. We are not members of groups. We are people created in the image of God, and therefore we all have innate value and worth, but we are fallen and sinful and depraved, and so we need limits. That is the kind of person that we are educating. We are incarnational beings, by which I mean we are fully spiritual and fully physical, not souls trapped in bodies, but enfleshed souls. We are creatures that desire virtue and desire community and desire to build. That is who we are, and how are we to educate such a people? In my book, there are two parts. The first part lays down some of the essential elements that makes classical Christian education so unique, especially unique from our public utilitarian progressive education. Number one, classical Christian education is not vocational, it is liberal arts. It is about freeing the mind to escape from the propaganda of the world, teaching us to think logically and freely, which is what the word liberal means. Number two, we read books that are not ideologically correct, but that are part of the canon, the great books of the Western intellectual tradition upon which our culture was built. Homer and Virgil and Dante and Shakespeare and Milton and Aquinas and Augustine and Luther and Calvin. We read the great books and we wrestle with them. And we don't read textbooks. We read the books themselves, because there is no better way to form virtuous, morally self-regulating citizens than a wrestling match with the great ideas that have been passed down to us over the last 3,000 years. We believe in the great books, and we are unapologetic about that. We are not strapped to social studies as the center of education. We focus not on social studies, but on history, the choices and decisions that people have made over the last thousands of years that have shaped who we are. More generally speaking, we are grounded in the humanities and not in the social sciences. That is because we believe we were made in God's image but fallen, rather than believing we are members of groups who are unable to think outside of those groups. This is the kind of education we provide. We do not provide a relativistic education, but an education that believes there are absolute standards of goodness, of truth, and of beauty, and that undergirds all that we teach. Finally, and this is the first part of my book, I focus on how classical Christian education is driven by virtues, courage, wisdom, self-control, justice, and not by values, diversity, equity, inclusion, environmentalism, multiculturalism. We are focused on the virtues that have been with us for thousands of years, and not sort of modern, fabricated, politically correct values. We are raising people up to be virtuous, morally self-regulating citizens. That is the first half of my book. And the second half of my book, I go into a direct dialogue with some of the most influential educators of the last several thousand years. I start with Plato's Republic, because that is foundational to education. But I also look at Augustine, the great Christian philosopher and theologian who was so strongly influenced by Plato. I look at his unchristian doctrine. But then I look at two people that are at the foundation of modern progressive utilitarian education, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and John Dewey. I show that they have strengths, but I also show some of the dangers, the Pandora's box that they opened up and led us to some of the problems we have in education today. After that, I look at the Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. I think the most important educational book of the 20th century. I then look at Dorothy Sayers and her attempt to bring back the trivium of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. I look at Charlotte Mason, who looks for a natural education, not like Rousseau, but one grounded in people who are made in God's image but fallen. Finally, I look at three more modern writers, E.D. Hirsch, Mortimer Adler, and Neil Postman, all of whom we would call more, quote, liberal, but all of who believe that if you want a true liberal free society, you need to study the great books that have shaped who we are. I strongly encourage you to go to Amazon.com, look up Passing the Torch, an apology for classical Christian education. It is now available for pre-order, and it will be published at the end of April. Thank you, and fight for education.